The Industrial Revolution ran from 1760 till 1840, and the Victorian era came hot on the heels of it, running from 1837 to 1901. Now, the Victorian era is known as the golden era for innovation. The rapid nature of the technological, political, and societal changes that it brought about are unprecedented in history. In fact, no group of people have had more influence on the world as we know it than the Victorians. And with this in mind, here are 6 cool facts about them. The Victorians went through an explosive population boom. At the start of Queen Victoria's reign in 1837, the population of England and Wales was 15.5 million. By the end, it was 32.5 million. That means it more than doubled, and this does not even take into account all the millions of Brits who left during the period for other parts of the Empire and the US. And this unprecedented population boom transformed Britain into by far and away the most densely populated landmass on the planet, something which is still true to this day. Children, for the first time in history, were expected to live rather than die. For all of human history, children have been expected to die rather than live. This was just the way it was. It was normal. It's normal for every species. But then in 1798, Dr. Edward Jenner created the first vaccine, which was designed to protect against smallpox, which at the time was the biggest killer of children. Now, obviously, this innovation came before the Victorian era, but it set in motion a process which the Victorians accelerated big style, and that process was healthcare innovation. For example, through Florence Nightingale, who was the mother of the nursing industry and is most noted for creating hygiene in hospitals, the Victorians gave us nurses. Through antiseptic and anesthesia, they gave us the means to fight against germs and perform safe surgery. Now, it should be noted that germ theory was a joint discovery made by French chemist and microbiologist Louis Pasteur, English surgeon Joseph Lister, and German physician Robert Koch, but it was the Victorians who largely brought it into the hospitals, and the results of all this progress by the Victorians can be seen by looking at the massive improvements in the mortality rates of children during their era. For example, in the year 1800, 33% of children never made it past the age of 5. By the year 1900, despite the insane poverty of the Victorian era, the number was down to 22%, which is a 50% improvement, but it's not the only improvement. You see, whereas in the 1700s, between 50 and 60% of children never made it past the age of 15, by the end of the Victorian era, the majority of children who made it past the age of 5 were making it into adulthood, which was absolutely revolutionary. The Victorians were synonymous with sexual prudishness, but men arguably had it worse. Yep, stop the presses and know what you're thinking. That can't be right, but hear me out on this. With population numbers booming and poverty exploding as a result, the Victorians inevitably became extremely sexually prudish. After all, if you live in a world with no contraception and you have a brand new healthcare system that is creating a world where babies are living in large numbers instead of dying in large numbers, inevitably sex suddenly becomes very dangerous. Here is the interesting thing though. Most people think the onus was put on women during this era, but it was actually put on both men and women equally. But arguably for men, it was a lot more painful. Here's why. You see, whereas women were so heavily policed that they were expected to not even blow out candles for fear of puckering their lips in a sexual way, the men were pushed to not even share a drop of their seminal fluid with anyone, even their wives. Yep, you heard me right. The Victorians sold men the message that ejaculating even once would make them weak and feeble. I mean, imagine that. Sorry, darling, I can't have sex with you. It'll make me weak and feeble. It's madness, I know, but what's nuts is this isn't even the craziest thing. The craziest thing is the extremes men were pushed to go to avoid erections. For example, there was this thing called a penile pricking ring. This was invented in the 1850s, and it is as horrific as it sounds. It was based on something called a pollutions ring, which itself was invented in the 1700s. And what it is basically a cock ring with metal prongs on it. You didn't mishear that. A cock ring with metal prongs on it. Men were recommended to wear it overnight to ensure that they did not even get erections overnight, and it was very good at ensuring that they did not, because the moment there was even a hint of firmness, they would be stabbed with needles which would bring them wide awake. Yep, imagine being so anti-sex that you create what is basically a tool of torture to try to stop men even having erections in their sleep, which they are supposed to have to keep their sexual function healthy. But in the end, I guess that's what an out of control birth rate does to a society. It sends them mad, which is perhaps a lesson for the benefits of contraception. Women's underwear was mostly crotchless. Considering the previous point, this seems crazy, but it's true. For underwear, Victorian women mostly wore a pair of long bloomers, but those bloomers, though they stretched to the waist, were only designed to cover the legs, so not the crotch, which means Victorian women, members of the most prudish era in history, mostly favoured crotchless underwear. In terms of why, not for sexual reasons, obviously, it was actually down to the simple fact that their clothing was so heavy and was comprised of so many different layers that crotchless underwear became the only way for them to avoid having to spend ages undressing to go to the bathroom and then ages redressing afterwards. The Victorians revolutionized, and some argue near enough even invented, the women's fashion industry. The Victorians may be synonymous with prudishness, but it is undeniable that they took fashion to places it had never even dreamt of going previously, especially women's fashion. Literally, some of the dresses women ended up wearing were so outrageous and so wide that they literally got stuck in doorways. Yep, imagine that, getting stuck in a doorway because of your outfit. But the risks did not just stop there. Women literally died for their outfits in the Victorian era. You heard me right. Frequently, the dresses were made with flammable fabrics, which, considering that most Victorian era homes were lit by candles or gas lights, was a recipe for disaster, and it is estimated that thousands of women died because their dresses caught fire. But it wasn't just women who died for Victorian era fashion, it was animals and insects, and this wasn't just about animal fur. Women from the era would literally wear dead animals and dead insects. In fact, doing so was the height of fashion. For example, bird hats, so hats that were literally made with the stuffed remains of a dead bird, and fox and ferret scarves, which were literally the animals stuffed, became so popular it pushed a number of species to the brink of extinction. Great crested grebes, which are highly attractive birds, were lucky to survive the era, as were seabirds like kittywinks and many others. Tattoos were popular in the Victorian era. If you look at how tattoos are frowned upon today and then consider how the Victorians were, you would think it crazy they could have been popular, but it's the truth. Tattoos became extremely popular and fashionable in the Victorian era, so much so, even Queen Victoria herself was rumoured to have had tattoos, the most famous being that of a Bengal tiger fighting a python. But it wasn't just her. Her son, Albert, who would later go on to become King Edward VII, while on an official trip to Jerusalem in 1862, had a Jerusalem cross tattooed on his arm. Also, Albert's son, who would later go on to become George V, while on an official tour to Japan in 1881, had a red and blue dragon tattooed on one arm and a tiger on the other. And this is barely scraping the barrel for how popular tattoos were amongst the royals and aristocracy. For example, of note, Winston Churchill's mother, Lady Randolph Churchill, reportedly had a serpent on her wrist, and the list goes on. The point is, though, they were popular, and not just amongst the rich, but with regular folk as well. For example, the everyday man of the time favoured things like naval themes along with religious symbols and tokens of love, while the everyday woman favoured things like butterflies and birds and things like that. In terms of why there are not loads of pictures of tattooed men and women from the Victorian era, tattoos were seen as more of a personal thing by the Victorians, so they were not for show. This is why the majority of the tattoos were always in places where they could be easily concealed. Oh, and if you're wondering why tattoos went out of fashion, it actually happened in the 1930s. Basically, they became popular amongst prisoners, which led the rich to start denouncing them. The rest of society then followed, which, you know, always seems to happen. That's all from me. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, remember to give it a like and subscribe to my channel, because the more who do so, the more of these I can make. Is that a good bribe? I hope it is. I'll see you next time.